Alright, so this video is going to cover Objective 2 from Chapter 13. We're going to start talking about all of the parts of the brain, and we're going to start with the cerebrum, which is going to be the largest part of the brain. As you can see, we've got 4 major parts, and we're going to be covering each one as we go through Part 1 of Chapter 13. So you have the cerebrum, which is this large wrinkly portion here, and inside of the cerebrum you have the diencephalon, and so that was actually talked about a little bit in the embryonic development, and so we'll be taking a closer look at that. We also have the brain stem, which is composed of the midbrain, the pons, and the medulla, and then we have the kind of large ball at the base of the brain called the cerebellum. So this video is going to focus on the cerebrum, the largest portion of the brain, and it's going to be the longest video because there's the most to talk about. And so just to kind of recap what we've already learned about development. So the cerebrum is derived from the prosencephalon, which differentiates into the telencephalon. So this is one of your 3 primary vesicles, and then this is going to be one of the 5 secondary vesicles. And so it is the largest part of the brain. It consists of 2 hemispheres. It also consists of the cerebral cortex, which is the outer portion, and the medulla, which is more in the middle. We divide it into 4 lobes, kind of based on function and structure. And then there's several other structures that are within the cerebrum that we're going to take a quick look at. And so within the cerebrum, if you were to cut it open, you can see that this wrinkly portion outside, that is what we call the cerebral cortex, and it's made of gray matter. And so hopefully you remember from the nervous system notes that gray matter consists mostly of cell bodies and dendrites. And then the cerebral medulla is going to be more inside, and that is going to be your white matter, which is actually made up of axons that are myelinated, and that's why it appears to be white. So the wrinkles, the actual raised portion of the wrinkles are known as a gyrus or gyri for plural. And then the areas that are kind of valleys or grooves, those are called a sulcus or sulci for plural. And the way I remember this is that the sulcus sinks in, or the sulci sink in, and so you have your ridges, which are the gyri, and then you have your little valleys, which are going to be your sulci. Now there's one giant longitudinal fissure. A fissure is just a deeper groove, and so the brain is separated into your 2 hemispheres by the longitudinal fissure. And the brain is actually not attached up here. If you were to, like when we did the sheep dissection, you can take your finger and kind of run it along that longitudinal fissure, and the 2 hemispheres are not connected all the way through the brain. They are connected at a structure though called the corpus callosum. It's kind of shaped like a C inside the brain, so if we were to cut it right here along this longitudinal fissure, where they're connected is called the corpus callosum, and it's just an area of white matter, and it is a major pathway between the 2 hemispheres. So just a refresher, the gray matter is cell bodies and dendrites. There's some other types of neuron cells that you can find there. You've got white matter, which is your axons because they're myelinated. And then within the white matter, there are 3 types of fibers or kind of nerve tracts. So you have these association fibers, and you can see that over here, if you are in the same hemisphere, these fibers are going to connect structures when you're in the same hemisphere, either left or right. You have your commissural fibers, and this is where they are connecting them from between the 2 hemispheres, and these are the type of connectors that you're going to find in the corpus callosum. And you can see, here's that corpus callosum in the picture, and that's where you find those commissural fibers. And then you have your projection fibers that are going to connect your brain like to the spinal cord and other parts of the central nervous system. So they connect the cerebrum like to the brain stem and the cerebrum on into the spinal cord. So next we're going to look at the 4 major lobes, okay, and so if you wanted to kind of divide these anatomically, it's based on certain gyri and sulci. What we kind of mostly know is just the general areas. You don't necessarily have to know the exact location where they are separated, but we can break it down into the frontal lobe, the parietal lobe, the occipital lobe, and the temporal lobe. And we should be familiar with those from when we've covered the skull. Okay, they go right along with those terms that we've already discussed, as well as just our general anatomical terms. And so there is a very important sulcus, and this is going to be the sulcus, or the groove or the valley that divides the frontal lobe here and the parietal lobe here. And there are two very important gyri. On either side of the central sulcus, there's a precentral gyrus, which is the one that comes before it. That's going to be part of the frontal lobe. And then we have the postcentral gyrus, which is going to be part of the parietal lobe. And both of these are important because in the precentral gyrus, we have the primary motor cortex. So this pretty much controls almost all of your voluntary movements of your skeletal muscle. And then your postcentral gyrus is a major sensory area. It is our primary somatosensory cortex. Somato means body. So this is our main body sensory area for things like touch. So two very important gyri regions that are responsible for our primary motor and our primary sensory. Now, a long time ago, I can't remember the name of the person that did it, but this has been around for quite a while. But when you look at the motor cortex and the sensory cortex, they can kind of be mapped based on what those different regions affect. And so every part of the body has a particular region that controls its movement. So like in that motor cortex, the medial portion, you can see the part that's right there by that longitudinal fissure. It's going to control things like the legs and the feet. We've got the head, shoulder, and arm. And so your motor homunculus is just going to be a map. Now, you can see that some body parts appear to be larger than others. And so what that means is there's going to be more space taken up to control those. And the finer the movements, the more space they take up. So like your fine motor movements, like you pick up small objects, you can see that the hand is very large. Your senses here are pretty large. And so the homunculus is just a map that kind of shows where and how much control there is in the different portions of that part of the brain. There's also one for sensory, the sensory homunculus. It's also a map, and very similar to the motor homunculus, you see that different areas of the body are controlled by different areas of that primary somatosensory cortex. And so sensations do occur all along the body, and so we're just seeing where. Once again, that medial portion looks like it's going to be mostly the feet, whereas you have a lot of your senses coming up as you move toward the lateral side. And so just to compare the two, these guys here kind of represent the same thing as like how they drew it on the brain itself. And you can see that there's a lot of area covered that controls the hands, that controls the face, the tongue, things like that. But there are slight differences between the motor and the sensory, but for the most part, they kind of follow the same basic patterns. All right, so now we're going to take a look at those lobes and what they do. So starting with the frontal lobe, we've already established that there's a lot of motor control in that precentral gyrus. And so this is going to be your voluntary movement, things like your seeing, your skeletal muscles, your speech. There's also connections to your personality. In fact, damage to your frontal lobe can change your personality. There's some short-term memory and judgment as well, kind of like your impulse control, things like that are also in your frontal lobe. You have your parietal, which we've already established is kind of that sensory area, so it controls the major sensations like your tactile senses like touch. It also helps you kind of sense like general body position. You have your occipital at the back of the brain, and this is actually responsible for your vision. And then you have your temporal lobe, which it's kind of by your ears, so it makes sense that they also play a role in auditory. Okay, there's also going to be some memory functions, both like long term, like when you smell something and it takes you back to a memory, those types. And so here's just kind of a summary of your major lobes and what they do. Now, another scientist named Brodmann, he came up with what was called the Brodmann's areas, and these terms still are used today. And so what he did was he kind of based on tissues divided the brain into 52 separate regions. And so these regions or these areas are still used today. So you can see that area 4 was the primary motor cortex. Areas 44 and 45 are the Broca's areas. So sometimes when you're looking at parts of the brain and what they do, it'll talk about the areas that they contain. And so I just wanted you to be familiar with these. You don't have to know which numbers are what function, but just know that the cerebral cortex can be divided based on their anatomy as well as what they do. And then we're going to take a look at some other areas of the cerebrum. Now these are going to be within the cerebrum, so they're going to be within other lobes. But you have a structure called the hippocampus, and the word means seahorse, and so it's kind of shaped like, you can kind of see like the head of a seahorse here and the tail. And so the hippocampus is in the temporal lobe, and so there's going to be two, but it's involved in memory. And we also have the amygdala. Okay, and we can see that it is also going to be in the temporal lobe, and so there's going to be two of those as well. So here you have your hippocampus, here you have your amygdala, and so it's a cell body collection. It's nuclei in the brain, and what they do is they process fear, emotions, and they help to initiate that fight or flight response in the sympathetic nervous system. Now this isn't necessarily a for sure. There's a lot of unknowns when it comes to social interactions and addiction, but there could be a connection between that amygdala and those kind of issues. And then we have the limbic system, which you can see the amygdala that we just looked at as well as the hippocampus are both part of that limbic system. And so the limbic system is just a collection of structures that play a role in emotion, memory, and behavior. And emotion is a very complex thing. There's a lot of different components to our emotions. You can see that there's some other parts here. There's like some communication connectors. Here we see the hypothalamus. We're going to take a look at that as well. And there's some other portions. But all of this together, the whole limbic system, is all about emotion, memory, and behavior. We also have basal nuclei, and not to be confusing, but they can sometimes be called basal ganglia, even though ganglia are typically found in the peripheral nervous system. In the central nervous system, we call them nuclei. And so they're just some collections of cell bodies that play a role in motor function and cognitive function. And you can see some that are labeled and identified here in the brain. You don't have to know all the specifics, but we're going to see a disease that's related to this one here shortly. And that disease is Parkinson's disease. My grandmother actually had this disease, and so it's not one that is fun to watch. But essentially you have the breakdown or the death of some of these basal nuclei. And what they do is they release dopamine. And dopamine is a neurotransmitter. It actually has many functions, but one of its functions is controlling movement. And so as these neurons in these basal nuclei die, what happens is they no longer release dopamine at the same rate like they're supposed to. And so what happens is the person over time kind of loses control of their movements. A lot of times it's connected with like tremors and shakes and things like that. And over time there can be a lot of other motor related issues. It's a degenerative disease, so it just continues to break down over time. As those neurons die, they're never replaced, and so it progresses as more and more of those neurons die, the greater the symptoms that you're going to see. So there is no cure. There are medications that can be taken. They give a substance called L-Dopa. It kind of helps to increase the dopamine. It's able to cross the blood-brain barrier, but over time the patient stops responding to them. And so what can happen sometimes is it can lead to some other mental issues. And so it's just, once again, a degenerative disorder. And so what happens is that release of dopamine is affected, which is going to affect the movement of the patient that has it. All right, a couple other areas of the cerebrum that are important. Once again, these are going to be within the lobes, but we have some two important areas that are responsible for language. And that's going to include like motor function like reading and writing, motor function like speaking, but also cognitive function like understanding. And so you have your Wernicke's area. This is going to help you understand. Okay, this is in the temporal lobe. And so this helps you comprehend actually, you know, spoken words and written language. And then you have your Broca's area, which is actually a motor area. This one is going to be in the frontal lobe, near that motor cortex here, you can see. And the Broca's area is going to be responsible for the actual movements required for speech. And so you have like your larynx, your voice box, the tongue and cheeks, the lips. All of those things have to move in order for us to create speech. And so if you had damage to either one of these areas, it could affect your ability to speak or your ability to understand language. All right, and that's going to be the end of video 2. We are going to finish up the rest of the brain in the next video.